After every quarter, Ghana's economy reports to the hospital to be diagnosed, and this hospital has always been the Ghana Statistical Service, whether the economy is performing well, downwards, or well, backwards. And this is something we're going to be assessing today from the latest figure released by the Ghana Statistical Service about how the economy has been growing. Interesting enough, that dynamics has been consistent from the January to now about how the economy has been performing from sector to sector, from farming to agri, from services, industry. We'll be delving deeper into that analysis. Also, some key development from those figures is what we'll be throwing light on this afternoon. Many are waiting to see indeed what policy has the government put in place. The numbers are there, but the real movers and shakers of the economy will surely be diagnosed today to see whether the government has indeed been reflective about how this transformation has improved various sectors. My name is Winston Taki, and I'm doing this with
Caleb Zablem.
Let's go to the third quarter analysis, beginning from the first quarter. Basically, on this number, as you can see, 5.5% is the figure the Ghana Statistical Service says the economy in the third quarter has improved. So we've grown by 5.5%. And this number, interestingly, is lower than that which we made last year, 2024, which was basically 7.0%. So the economy has slightly, let's say, drawn or come down or dwindled in the third quarter of 2025 compared to last year, third quarter, which was basically 7.0%. But if you assess these numbers on quarter basis, it's an improvement in that angle. So, Caleb, what do you say?
Yeah, so like you said earlier, the GDP growth rate is how your economy has grown compared to the previous quarters. So in quarter 3 of 2025, the economy grew by 5.5%. And if you compare it to 2024, the same quarter 3 of 2024, the economy grew by 7%. So you can go to the next slide. We show 7% last year at the same time. The economy grew, so your economy expanded. It means you produce more. So you produce more in 2024 than you are producing now, or you are still producing more. So we produce more by 7% in 2024. This year we are doing 5.5%. And the interesting thing, and it's interesting because when I was going through the numbers, you could see that when we discovered oil and we were doing our GDP figures, we were scared. We thought that, okay, if we add oil to the overall GDP, oil might take a big share, and then we might say the economy is growing. Meanwhile, the core sectors of the economy is not growing. So we're scared that oil might deceive us in a way, that we are producing so much oil, so we might say the economy is growing rapidly. Meanwhile, the core sectors, agri and industry, is not growing very well. But then we are seeing a reverse in that trend, because recently, because of how the oil sector is doing, and we'll get to that very shortly, if you take out oil from our GDP, the economy actually grew by 6.8%. If you add oil to it, you grew by 5.5%. So now, adding oil to your overall GDP is actually pulling your growth down. So back then, the narrative
this is more a realistic growth.
Exactly.
How the economy is performing.
We are not relying on oil and gas anymore.
Yes.
Because back then, the thinking was that oil might overshadow the entire economy. So let's do non-oil GDP and oil GDP. But now, over the past 5 years or so, every time non-oil GDP is performing better when you take out GDP from the entire sector. So we'll get into that later on. But then it's very interesting to know that when you take out oil from that, we actually did 6.8%. And when you add oil to it, now 5.5%.
And the dynamic trend has been showing since 2014, where we've seen the figures growing from 4.0% to basically around 10-11% growth. In 2016, where basically 2017, we're basically around 12% growth. But interestingly, we've been falling below the 10% mark since 2020, and that numbers has been consistent up to the second quarter of 2024. And these numbers kind of tells you a very interesting growth trajectory, and that is what we've been seeing for quite some time.
If you can go back, I wanted to make a point here briefly.
Yes.
So if you look at the graph, you can see that from 2017 to 2020, that was before the pandemic, we're seeing very high growth rate, this quarter on quarter. So we're seeing very high growth rates. Then the pandemic came, we saw what happened. Even though the overall 2020, the economy actually grew, some quarters contracted. And then from there, we've seen a very stable, growth rate. And then this year, that's in red, you can see that we've been consistently higher than previous years, which is good news for the economy, because once you want to take the country out of poverty, which is the thinking, you have to sustain your growth rates. So we don't like this. We don't like the volatility. We want sustainability. So if you can sustain a growth rate for a very long time, you're better off than the ups and downs, going high in this quarter, going low in the next quarter. But as we can see now, we are slightly stable and slightly above from 2020 after the pandemic. But then before the pandemic, you can clearly see that the economy was growing higher quarter on quarter. At points we are about 14% in a quarter, which is massive. This year we are doing 5.5. Last year the highest was about 7. So there's still room for improvements, but then the consistency is what we need at this point, because once you are consistent, that's where you can rope on all the people in the economy together and then move out from poverty and all of that.
It's interesting to note that in the last 2 years, we've seen the mining and quarrying sector, that is the various industry sector, being the key movers of the economy. Yeah. And we kept asking how is it reflective, although the services sector contributes about mostly between 30 to 40% of overall GDP. And we've seen that reflective in every sector. But the mining and quarrying sector was holding the economy until the latter part of this year. But we were kind of hoping that these numbers will be quite reflective, considering the fact that the mining and quarrying sector hold the huge kind of development. Looking at how the international price of commodities are performing, we're indeed banking our hopes on cocoa. But in 2014, our cocoa prospects were not quite high, but there were some sentiment being expressed by cocoa farmers. They cited galamsey as one of the key challenges we're facing, although the mining sectors kind of was eaten into the cocoa sector, and that gave a negative prospect into 2025 basically. So initially, most of the farmers were not quite optimistic whether they can meet the 350,000 metric tons of cocoa that the Cocoa Board promised to make at the end of the season. But now we are seeing that there have been several interventions coming into 2025, and this intervention, we are yet to see the outcome before the close of the year from the Cocoa Board in terms of numbers, whether they perform as much as they can. But we are seeing that these numbers in the third quarter, the GDP is telling you that amongst many sectors, they are great quarter by quarter. First time in the second time in a long time, the agri sector is leading, and that is a very interesting number there.
Yes, and before, also every time we're going through our GDP figures, the number one is services. And it's understandable because services employs most of the Ghanaians. The informal sector and all of that is mainly through services. And then we go to agric. Agric is the highest employer in the country. So usually it's services and agric before industry. There's a time where industry was doing very well, but then over the past few years, industry is not doing very well. And then we'll get to why that's happening. But then this is the first time in a very long time now we are seeing the agric sector being the major growth factor in the GDP figures, which is good news. And also, if you remember, earlier in the past month or two, farmers were complaining of a glut. They produced more than they anticipated, and the markets wasn't absorbing that. So this is also part of why the agric sector, we've seen a massive growth here, because there was a glut in supply. Now, if you move this to a policy perspective, this should inform government's decisions moving forward. If you have the agric sector performing very well, eventually it should translate into reduced food prices on the market. And then we've seen the inflation figures for November. Food inflation usually was significantly higher than non-food inflation. But for the first time, food inflation and non-food inflation was very close. I think food inflation was 6.6, non-food was about 6.1 thereabout. So it's very close now. So even though food prices are not rising as much as before, they are still elevated. And then this is where government needs to step in to provide the structures to support the glut, because the glut was one of the major factors. We're talking about
structure, which is very important, because if you don't forget, somewhere last year, that is during the festive season, the 2024, before the election, we understood that there were a lot of issues concerning access to farm product into the market. We saw when the government decided that they are going to ban importation of grains into the system, and that became a key conversation. And most of the grain farmers decided to invest, plow back their profit into the grain market, and that is what we experienced the glut in the first quarter of 2025. And that policy direction brought some kind of optimism in domestic farmers, decided that they are going to produce enough to feed domestic market. The key challenge, like you mentioned, is structure, connecting the farm product to produce to the real demand in the market.
To the market, yeah.
The market. And that has been the central challenge. If the Agric Ministry, the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, is able to resolve that structural challenge, I'm sure there will not be instances as we experience it today, where we go to the market, there are a lot of products day by day. Most of them are basically being spoiled because of unpreserved, or let's say, access to the market. Until we had the president himself making money available to the buffer stock, where they have to buy goods, advice on how to get these goods to the secondary schools and most institutions. So these are not just numbers, but they should be backed by policy decisions.
They should translate into how the government takes action moving forward, because these are the figures of your economy.
Yes.
And once you have how your economy is faring, where the jobs are being created, where production is happening more, focus on those ones. And also where production is not happening, like industry, focus on that as well. So we need to step on the back of this, increase in production from the agri sector to produce more. Also, there was also a time where, because of some national security issues, the exports of grains were banned. So if we see that there's a glut, governments cannot absorb it, the private sector cannot absorb it. You need to start looking about how you can either incentivize private sector so that they can absorb the glut, resource the state-owned national buffer stock so that they can buy the produce, keep it in their silo, so that there's no because in the glass situation you tell that farmers were disadvantaged, even though they were producing more, and this is contributing to why agri sector is also doing very well. They were disadvantaged. They did not benefit from this in any way, and they had to sell their produce at very, very low prices.
And this is a very interesting story. And let's not forget, the holder of the economy in the previous quarters, the industry sector, consisting of basically mining and other services, and the production of oil, petroleum.
This is where oil lies.
Yes, and so for us to see this, because we know the crude oil prices is making a good stride in 2025. However, in previous years, we've seen the sector diminish in terms of growth. We did a 50-year analysis here on the show, assessing how Ghana has actually benefited. Don't forget, one very important challenge that I foresee here is that government has decided to back its hopes on this big push agenda of revenue from the oil sector. And with that being said, it becomes a key conversation that will expand later on the show, because if government is deciding that this big push, road construction, high capital intensive project nationwide, if the revenue is not coming, the budget has already been decided, but how funding is a key challenge. Already government has removed certain taxes that will make it available for more funding processes. We are out of the international market. Access to huge capital is a challenge. So this is a conversation that is reflective of whether government will be able to manifest its realistic promises that it's made in its manifesto going forward. But let's not forget, the sector has its own challenges, and let's look at the growth trend in the oil and gas sector.
So when we found oil, that was in about 2010 thereabouts, but then our GDP was rebased in 2013. So the GDP figures start from 2014 now because it was rebased. And I think there's conversation within the Ghana Statistical Service to rebase it again in 2028 or so. So from 2014, you could see the sector wasn't doing well. It was almost zero growth, and then we contracted a bit to 58%. That's contraction. Then in 2017, there was a spike. Some oil fields came on board and all of that. So there was optimism that, okay. And like I said earlier, we're so optimistic that the oil was going to drive our growth so significantly that we needed a separate mechanism for accounting for oil GDP and non-oil GDP. So we saw this in 2017, where some new oil fields and all of that came on board, and there was a 200% increment in or 200% growth in the oil and gas industry. So from 200%, now we are negative 18%, a contraction year on year. And you can see in red there, we've stayed below. We've been contracting, that's negative, from 2020 till now. It was in earlier this year that there was a slight jump, but then since then, we've been below the 0%. So we've been contracting every year, quarter by quarter, we've been contracting. This is bad news. And then we've already had the analysis on why this is happening, because a 5-year continued decline in crude oil production, government is failing to secure investments in the sector. Private investors cannot come on board because some of the policy missteps that had taken place in the past. And also just the overall sector is not looking very good, which is why the energy minister now said that he's making the upstream sector his priority. Because oil and gas can do wonders for your economy if you manage the policies in the sector very well.
As a media personnel, I have the privilege of going into press releases, media briefings, and some of the conversation that came to light previously was whether to put Tema Oil Refinery out for sale.
Yeah.
To the extent that they were putting it out for bids. Until recently, where we saw is the CEO currently come back, trying to bring light to that institution.
Yeah.
Don't forget, if we were able to add value to our crude oil production, our domestic price will be reflective of international output instead of we costing more to import. But if you look at what is happening now, if Tema Oil Refinery is back on track, all that we've lost in the last 15 years, we've been able to at least have more benefit from it. But the dwindling investment has been quite many companies holding onto oil licenses, deciding not to explore. So there are many companies who have decided that we want to explore. We bought this well, but we are delaying, looking at a more convenient time to invest or let's say to explore. And this has delayed the outcome from the sector. Lack of investment, positive policy indecision from government perspective. We saw Springfield conversation came to light. As of now, basically early this year, we came into the decision where government decided to extend the lease for 10 and West Point, that is a Jubilee Field, into 2026 for them to begin exploration. And they intend to invest about $2 billion into this exploration. They've renewed license for 20 new wells. And these are interesting conversations that if you are outside, I will tell you that government is ready to do business. But the key conversation that has to be done, the decisions has to be done, is whether these investments will be reflective of who or how much you're putting into it and how much government intends to make out of it. Whether government intends to own the Springfield outcome based on the negotiation or the decision that will come out of the committee decision. We hope to see whether government will have that muscle, especially in terms of funding, or whether they would seek partnership to explore that option.
So like the entire picture of the oil industry is not very good. And earlier this year, we saw that for the first 6 months of 2025 compared to last year, the revenue that the government got from the oil production dropped by almost 56%. That's more than half. We had $840 million last year. That's almost $1 billion. $1 billion can do so much.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. And this year, we did $370 million. That's a drop by almost 56%. And this is significant. And then, this all comes back to the policies and all of that governing the entire oil and gas and then oil exploration framework in the country. So, and also, like I said earlier, this is what's also pulling down the entire growth of the economy. So working on the oil and gas sector should be the priority of the government now. Because in industry, if you look at the entire basket of industry, this is the number one driver. That's why industry grew by just 0.8%. And last year, industry did almost 11%. So from 11% the same time to about 0.8%, it tells that it's a big problem somewhere. And if you look at, also go back into the fine lines, you see that manufacturing also is doing a bit well. Manufacturing grew by about 3%. If your manufacturing grows by 3%, your oil and gas sector drops by 18%. That's going to have the overall impact on your industry sector. And also, we keep talking about growing the economy. But then, if you want to grow the economy, you need to industrialize. So the focus needs to be on your agri sector and your industry. And then, we kind of see focus more on the agri sector and then to an extent the services sector. But the industry is always left behind.
But the industry has been interestingly had that support until recently where the government decided that, yes, we have to focus on the industry. And they realized that the Gold Board prospect is quite amazing. We are studying the numbers, and hopefully next week we'll bring the viewers up to date on what really the Gold Board has been doing, especially in terms of how much they've been able to generate.
How they're using their funds,
how they're using the funds on all the various activities. And this numbers tells you a different story. The exploration day by day, millions of barrels have been dropping from 2010 when we 2010,
that's when we started.
1.2, we started increasing to 37.2 million barrels, and we got to a point where we are basically around 71.4.
In 2017, that's what we saw new wells come on board. So we saw a spike in production from 2016 to 2017. Then we peaked at 2019 with 71.4 million barrels. But then since then, we've been downhill.
And this has been on the downward trajectory. Investment slowing down, lack of transparency in the sector, a lot of cases being sent to the arbitration courts settled, and this is not good for the market. Anytime the oil sector, it's a very sensitive sector.
Very, very sensitive.
Anything can happen. You can have $1 billion today, and the next few hours, everything can just go down the drain because the sector, international price can change everything. Domestic policy decision can change everything. The government can decide that we are closing certain walls because of certain policy indecision, and all of them can lead to loss of investment. But we're having a predictable serene is something we can fight for going, and that has been acknowledged by the mines minister. The Finance Minister himself, they're saying that this is a key challenge. We've lost so much and there's so much to be restored going forward. And this is just a picture of how the economy is looking like in 2025. That is the third quarter. Certainly the figures for the fourth quarter will be in January thereabouts, and to assess how we've been performing. So if you are in this country and you've seen some key development basically from all sectors, and this tells you how government's policies are reflective in key sectors. One thing that we didn't say here is the fishery sector that has seen a very impressive numbers there.
It was the highest in the agri sector.
The highest in the agri sector. It's very interesting, not just the crop, the fishery sector. So if you see the agri sector growing, it's because of the contribution of the fishery sector. Last year, they were below negative numbers in terms of growth.
It contracted
last year hugely. So I am quite specific. I have to go down to the farmers, to the fishmongers to understand what has been the new trend, especially in terms of the outlook. Basically, it could be the outboard motors that they brought into play, and basically also the kind of system or machinery they're using, and that will tell us the real figures. And this has been today's edition of Beyond the Numbers, and I did this with
Caleb Zeblem.
Yes, Kofi J is sipping wine somewhere, and certainly will be joining us next week. And this is an amazing edition. See you next week, same time, for another exciting conversation. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.